If you have your Bibles, I want to invite you to go to Matthew 5. If you're a guest, we've been in a series called The Sermon on the Mount, and really original. Sometimes we try to be creative with series that we're doing, but we just decided to keep this one sort of the way that we would all know it, walking, if you will, through the words of Jesus, verse by verse. He went up on the mountain, his people, his followers, if you will, went up with him. And I think there's something beautiful in that, because that's a choice we have to make. We can sit in this room and play church all we want, and I contend, without sounding negative or pessimistic, most people in America who call themselves Christians play that game pretty much week in and week out. Because I will go with what my dad has been saying, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. The problem in this country isn't the unsaved, it's those who claim to be saved. We're to be light in darkness, and our light is supposed to be stronger than the darkness. And that's what Jesus says. My light will snuff out the darkness when we choose to understand the power of that light. And there's something about the fact that we're never going to get the Sermon on the Mount unless we get the man on the mount. And to get the man on the mount, we have to go up. We have to be willing to make the climb, if you will, to put away our convenience, our comforts, and to say, listen, I want to be at the feet of Jesus. What did Jesus say? And that's what we're doing here in walking through. Let me set it up with this. In the book of The Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dante is the main character. He's a handsome young man with a promising future, but he's framed. He's set up, if you will, by some jealous rivals, and spends 14 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. Now, I don't know if you've read the book or not, but after he escapes from prison, he disguises himself and starts a new life as the mysterious Count of Monte Cristo. Hence, if you will, setting up the story. Again, I don't know if you have read it. But once he gets in this disguise, here's what he spends his life doing, at least the next 10 years. He calculates his revenge on the four men who framed him. And one by one, all four lives are ruined as Dante systematically unleashes his plan. Now, the word revenge is a strong word. It's a word that I'm going to guess that most of us would not put ourselves into that category. But I know the book, read the book, and I'm wondering if this is more our reality. We're more like Dante than we want to admit. In fact, as I was researching the book a little bit about people's response to it, I found it interesting that someone wrote these words: "The Count of Monte Cristo is a story of the human condition." The writer goes on to say, "We may put a smile on our face, yet all the time clenching a knife behind our back." I contend it to be true. Ever been cut off in traffic? Ever been someone cut you or cut in front of you in a line that you've been waiting in for some time? I just want you to pause for a moment, and I can't speak for you, so I will just speak for me. I am amazed of how much time that something in my heart moves to my mind, and I will give so much more time to what someone had did to me, and how little time I give to what he had already done for me. I just want you to think about this for a moment. This is going to be up for the rest of the series because I think it really fits in. How many of us, we love God with so much of our lives, and yet the more we think we climb and get closer to God, the more we look down and exhaust an incredible amount of energy looking at what other people are doing as if we are doing so good. and how little time we give to Him. This week, how much time did you give to an employee you feel like it's not working hard enough? How much time did you give to thinking of other people, not in light that God would bless them, that God would honor them, that God would move in them, but you spent a lot of time exhausted in comparison, because that's really what it is. Or maybe I should say this, how much time did you give to just thinking Jesus thoughts? But man, we love God, don't we? I just wonder how much time did we spend looking at other people's garbage, if you will? How much time did you talk about other people's garbage? I wonder how much time you gave to the trial of Donald Trump. And the unfairness of politics, instead of the unfairness of the cross of Jesus Christ, who was the greatest injustice ever done to mankind. I wonder how much time that you spent in your backyard with Jesus. Because that's where we keep Him, right? We don't want Him in our house. He's just part of the equation when we need Him. Or how much time did you spend at the door that He had spent everything He had knocking on? Saying, if you'll just open it up. Can you hear me knocking? If you just open it up, I'd like to come in and have a meal with you, you know? Let's sit at the table and talk about stuff that really matters. I'm not trying to be judgmental here because I'm not afraid to be vulnerable. It's risky. But this past week, I was driving down East 10th heading west. I always find that interesting. I was in East 10th heading west. And I got off on I-29 to go north, but I got off on I-29, and you know how it works. It's an on-ramp onto the expressway. I always find that interesting, that why we named it what it needs to be. And of course, we've been so inconvenienced because of all the roads that we never built ourselves, but we're so frustrated by all the potholes that the winter does, but we'll stay in the north and complain about what potholes do. But I'm getting on the on-ramp on I-29, and you know how it works, it's single file, right? And when you get down, at least the book that I've read, and I'm not saying I always keep it, but when I got my license, that you're to then put your blinker on and then blink over onto the expressway because it eventually merge anyway. So I got to the bottom and I blinked over, believe it or not, and I started moving over, and a horn sounded, and I looked in my rear mirror, and a car is flying up beside me, and there were two young people in it, and they were flipping me off. I mean, I'm just telling you, flipping me off, and you screaming at me, and blew around me, and then cut in front of me. And I was like, man, really? And I thought, I'm the pastor of a church. Can I just say, I wish I would have thought that? Because that didn't cross my mind. So I proceeded to follow them. Oh yeah, it's a true story. To the next off-ramp, of which I made sure that they knew I was behind them. And we got to the top of the ramp, and I thought, oh, for a moment, what am I doing? They turned left, and so I turned left and continued to follow them until I got to a gas station which they turned into, and I think at that moment they thought, oh my, we probably shouldn't have done this. And I have done about everything I can do to say, you shouldn't have done this. Until we got to the gas station, they turned in, and I literally stopped in the street for a moment. And I did what I'm doing right now. I thought, God, what is wrong with my heart? Really? Now, I'm going to advise you, this is not something you want to do. Because when you stop in the main traffic, you incite those behind you to repeat the event that you just were a part of. I found myself just kind of driving away and spending time with God, and I thought about this. What if that was actually permitted for a moment in time? I literally had a flash from this movie called Fried Green Tomatoes. And I remember the scene, and it flashed in front of me, and I thought, wow, can you imagine what this city would look like if for a moment we were permitted to do that? And let's just remove all the people who claim to not know Christ. That's my fear when I think of the words of Jesus. Because we have a lot of these phrases that get said loosely, but I wonder how loose they are. Like, do unto others before they do unto you. Shoot first, ask questions later. Don't get mad, get even. One of my favorites, if you're looking for your cat, check under my tire. You know what I'm talking about? If you have your Bibles, I'm going to invite you again, Matthew 5. I'm going to ask you to stand. Matthew 5. The words of Jesus. And I hope to be able to walk through this and pull this apart. Here's what he said. He said, you've heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury. You've heard the law. We'll come to that in a moment. And here's the law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, those are powerful words. You've heard it said, but I say. You've seen it done, but I say. Do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. Father, I know I need your help. I can't speak for anybody in this room, but I know I do. That was pretty graphic this week. I'm amazed. When I think about my heart, how quickly it moves to my mind, and how much energy I exhaust in what others have done to me, and how little time I spend of what you already did for me. So God, I know I need your help, and I pray that your word would go forth. And I pray this in the name of Jesus, and everyone says, amen. You may be seated. If you have your notes, I want to encourage you to take them out. And I just want to look at what I call the outrageous of Jesus, because he offers outrageous, if you will. Anything of Christianity is outrageous within our world. It's just so bizarre. It's like so different. Like, why would you do that? But that's the story of Jesus, and that's what it means when we meet Jesus, we are to be Jesus. And what I shared with you earlier, that wasn't being Jesus. That was being Keith. We can spend all of our time justifying, and that's what we do real well. That's our problem. Is we spend so much time in comparison, pointing fingers, talking to others, getting ourselves wrapped with others, rather than realizing who Jesus is. Is he really Lord or not? And I found myself just driving around with tears, confessing, admitting, being broken before my Lord. And I hope that maybe in a moment we might have that same posture as well. Here's Jesus' outrageous teaching, if I can put it sort of in just simple terms. Here's the first thing he says: reject what is acceptable. Say that with me. Reject what is acceptable. So let me just tell you another story. It was about a young soldier, true story, while serving overseas during Desert Storm, received one of those Dear John letters. Okay, you already know where this is going, from his girlfriend, his fiance. And to add insult to now his broken heart, she wrote these words, "Will you please return my favorite photograph of myself? I need it for my engagement picture in the local newspaper." Now, if you know anything about military, there's a brotherhood. And as you can imagine, the guy is now devastated. His comrades aren't going to let this one lie. So they went throughout the camp and collected all the pictures of all of the other guys' girlfriends. Then they filled a shoebox with them with this note and sent it to the girl. "Please find your picture and return the rest. For the life of me, I can't remember which one you are." Okay? Now, we want to applaud that. That's exactly what Jesus is saying, don't do. Isn't it crazy? Our natural human bent, which we're supposed to lay at the cross daily. There's just something about us, isn't it? That somehow we think our job is to make things fair, to make things right. For us, if you will, to be the justice in an injustice. And our minds get consumed with it. I don't know about you, but mine does. But when Jesus said those words, "You heard it said," do you know what he's saying? I know what the norm is. I know what's acceptable. I know what's being taught. I know what goes on social media. You've heard it said. The acceptable. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Let me help you with this. See, up until Moses, these are God's people, all right? Jesus is talking about what Moses had written to God's people, the church. And what was happening among God's people is they weren't doing an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. They sort of felt like this is just unfair. So we're going to go one step further, right? You hurt me, oh, I am going to really hurt you. You punched my tooth out in the parking lot brawl. I'm going over and I'm going to burn your house down. That was happening among God's people on a daily basis. So Moses writes a law. You can read it in Deuteronomy, you can read it in Numbers, you can read it in Leviticus. He says, we've got to make this thing right. We got to put a ceiling on this. We got to make even fair. So he said, listen, if you lose an eye, you can take theirs, but just one. If you lose a tooth, then you get to take a tooth. Just one. That's fair. Jesus goes, no. Seems so right, doesn't it? See, this is why when people say to me, they're like, you know, hey, we gotta push the Old Testament aside. That's Old Testament law. Let me tell you something. Old Testament law was a whole lot better than what Jesus proposed. That's why it's amazing to me when they go, well, tithing is an Old Testament thing. Well, you ought to go back to it because all God said was 10%. You know what Jesus says? I want it all. I'm not okay with tithing. If you're going to be my follower, I want it all. This is what Jesus is getting at. It was so much easier when you went through a difficult situation of the law, but Jesus says, no. I don't want you to do the acceptable. I want you to do something that's totally abnormal. I say, you've heard it said, I say, you see how things get played out, but I say, and he does what he always does. He turns the tables upside down. And he says, I want you to reject what is acceptable. And here's the second thing I want you to write down. I want you to respond with what is abnormal. I want you to do something. If you're my follower, I want you to do as I have done. I want you to be different. I want the world to go, what in the world are you doing? I want everything you do to cause them to turn their head and for them to ponder for a moment, because you're doing something that's just not normal. Folks, listen to this very carefully. If we're a follower of Jesus, there's always something greater than your rights. It's called responsibility. If you're a follower of Jesus, we live in a country that talks about rights. Jesus says, no, if you're my follower, you live for my responsibility. You've got something bigger that matters. It's not about rights. It's about being responsible. And then he offers 3 of the abnormal. And I want you to write the first one in. Just as simple as it says, turn to them your other cheek. See, now I've heard people say this. Jesus said, turn your cheek. No, he didn't say that. Jesus did not say turn your cheek. He said turn them the other cheek, which means first you've got to be offended. And then I want you to do something that's totally nuts. And I want to explain it to you, but I want to go back to what's the acceptable, because we hear things like this. I read about an old Irish preacher. Now, what do you think about this? Okay, this is an Irish man who used to be a fighter. And then God saved him and he became a preacher. In fact, not just any fighter, he was a professional boxer. He just happened to be in a town setting up a tent for an evangelistic evening when a couple of tough guys noticed who he was and remembered his former years and thought they would test the waters. So they walked up to the preacher, and without the preacher even speaking a word, the first one clocked him right in the jaw, laying him out on the ground. Picture this for a moment. Now, as you can imagine, normally he would come up swinging. He's a boxer. He has something built within. I'm going to take you out. But instead, he gets up slowly. He's rubbing his jaw and carefully walks right back to the guy who hit him. And before he could speak, the guy hit him again on the other side of the jaw and laid him out. This time, however, the preacher comes up, takes off his jacket, rolls up his sleeves, and he announces, I did as my Lord had instructed, but now he gave me no further instructions. Okay? This isn't what Jesus is talking about. See, we don't understand this, but we live in a world where people are okay with you being right or left-handed. Back in Jesus' day, being left-handed was not a good thing. Nothing was even thought about it in that moment. So the only thing that you could be would be right-handed. Now think about this for a moment. To offer someone the other cheek, and what Jesus says would be the right cheek, doesn't fit the punch. To get slapped on that cheek means it has to be a backhand. Anybody listening to Jesus knew exactly what Jesus was saying. And in that day and age, when someone backhanded you, that was an amazing insult. To get punched meant you were a man. To get backhanded meant you were not. And Jesus said, when someone comes and backhands you and makes you feel like this, offer them the other, and they'll backhand you again. That's not what we're taught in our world, people. Offer them the other cheek. They've made me feel so small. They made me feel so less than any value whatsoever. And you want me to offer? And Jesus goes, yeah, that's what I want you to do. And we're like, are you kidding me? I know what you've heard and seen. But I say, this is what Paul was getting at when he said, bless those who persecute you. That's the key word. Bless those who persecute you. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. that you're honorable, that you're honorable. If you've read any of the articles, you will know that there is a 48-year-old father in Oklahoma that may be a little different than us this morning, with his hands held high, tears running down his cheeks, thinking of the loss of his son in Haiti and his daughter-in-law. I'm pretty sure if you read the articles, he was, and my God is greater. My God is bigger. How about you? Do you turn and give them the other cheek and think what really matters? What someone had done to me or what he had done for me? See, I think how you and I respond to the injustices of life speak a whole lot more than how we respond to the justness in life. We're to turn the other cheek. Speaks volumes about this. Here's the second thing Jesus said that's abnormal. Give to them all you got. Give to them all you got. Like if someone wants to sue me and take my shirt, Jesus, you want me to give them my coat as well? And Jesus is like, yeah. But what we don't understand is how odd this is. But again, let me help you with this. Let me help you. Because you and I, we stop and think about a coat. No big deal. In fact, it's a lot easier for you and I to give someone our coat, but I'm not going to give him my shirt. And you think, well, Jesus is making this simple. No, he's not. Because again, we don't understand in the time that Jesus is speaking these words. What you and I take for granted was something of incredible value. Because you and I have something that they didn't have. We have the warmth of a home. We have the warmth of a bed. We have a warmth of a blanket. But back in that day, the average person pretty much had everything they had on. And their outer garment was more important than the inner one. Because on a cold day, this was their blanket. It's the only thing they had to keep warm. The value was beyond anything you could imagine, which if you could spend a little time historically understanding, you would understand the cross when they stripped Jesus down and they took his outer garment and began to gamble it away. The incredible insult in that moment of the very thing that Jesus would have kept warm with. And he's telling them, I know they took something, but I want you to give in return something of more value. And that just seems so unfair, especially in our country right now when we determine value as what's in it for me. That's how we make all of our investments. Call it what it is. We watch the trade of what happens, especially if we make an investment, and if it's not returning of what we want, we quickly switch it to something. So to make sure that we sort of have the ROI, right? Return on investment. And yet Jesus turns the tables one more time upside down. Jesus doesn't think that way. He doesn't teach that way. He says, do as I've done. No greater love than this, that you'd lay down your life just as I did on the cross. So when things are crossed, do we climb on the cross? Or do we return and get crossed? Jesus says no. Galatians 1 says, Jesus gave his life just as God had planned in order to rescue us from this evil world in which we live. Which means we're not to live like the world. We're not to do what's acceptable. We're to do what's abnormal. But then he adds one more. Go the extra mile. Like if someone forces you to go 1 mile, you want me to go 2? And Jesus is like, yeah. And again, we stop and we don't really understand this. Because in our world, going the extra mile is something that we see as a sort of, what do I want to call it? An inspirational mantra. You know, give 110%. When everybody else stops, you go one more. Shoot one more hoop. Push yourself a little bit harder. But this is not what they heard back then. See, in Jesus' day, this was a major inconvenience because you have to understand who Jesus is talking to. He's talking to the Jewish people. In their day, a Roman soldier, which they tried to stay away from, they didn't walk down the street with heads held high when a Roman soldier would come. When they would come, they would try to be invisible. Because at any given moment, a Roman soldier could see a Jewish person, take off his backpack, drop it on the ground and say, and by law, the Jewish person had to pick it up and carry it for 1 mile. Which means their entire day is completely destroyed. Now, I only say that if you're familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. That's another part of the layers that people miss. A Levite comes along, you all know the story, and then this Samaritan comes along and sees the man in the ditch. Not only does he take care of the man, he then pays for all of the care of the man. And when they'd heard that story, they remember this teaching as well. And so you come along, you're walking, and a Roman soldier says, listen, here's my backpack. Jesus says, don't just carry it for 1. Don't do the law. Take it 2. And do it with a sense of joy. Your day is messed up. I don't know how long you can walk a mile, but back then, that's all they ever did was walk. And all of your business dealings just went to pot. And I remind you, if 2 soldiers are walking together, after the 1 mile, the other soldier could drop his pack and you'd have to pick it up and now walk another mile. And Jesus says, listen, when you're forced, because it was force, to go 1 mile, go 2. Go beyond. Do something a lot more than would ever be had asked. Is that who you and I are? It's outrageous. And by the way, maybe you know the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. There was a man named Simon of Cyrene who happened to be in town. And he actually lives out this teaching. Because the Roman soldiers see him, pull him out of the crowd, and ask him to carry the cross of Jesus. That's exactly what was going on. It wasn't anything prophetic. It's a picture of actually what Jesus taught. And the man picked up the cross and he took it for Jesus to where Jesus would die. It's crazy. But by the way, this is exactly what Paul was getting at when he said, you do not belong to yourself. God bought you with a high price. You must honor God with your body. That's crazy to me. Our vision statement is to meet Jesus, and our mission statement is to be Jesus. Which means if we're truly a person who've met him, then we do what Jesus would have done. Turn to them the other cheek. Give them all that you got and go the extra mile. We reject what is acceptable and we do what's abnormal. And I will tell you, this is a lot easier said than done. I want to invite Chris to come out. I read a story about a traveler. She was in between flights. Maybe you've been there. So she went into a little store in the airport and bought a small package of cookies. You got the picture? She then sat down at her gate and began to glance over the newspaper she had bought as well. As she was reading, she became increasingly aware of a rustling noise. Looking over the top of her newspaper as she's sitting at a table, across from her is a man on the other side of the table helping himself to her cookies. He was well dressed. She couldn't believe it. Half angry, half embarrassed, she reached over and gently slid the package of cookies closer to her and then began to read her newspaper as she took one out and began to munch on it, sort of sending the message. Figuring he got it, she's looking at the newspaper and heard the rustling noise again. She looked up over the newspaper and the man was helping himself to another package of to her package of cookies. She could not believe this. When she looked down, there's only one left. The dude had eaten most of her cookies. She could not believe this. Then, to add insult to her now injury, he gets up. Before he does, takes the last cookie, breaks it in half, slides her half, eats the other in front of her, and walks away. She cannot believe this. What would you do if you're in that moment of time? Blown away, dumbfounded, she hears her flight called. She opens up her handbag to get her ticket, and to her shock, there in her purse is the package of cookies she had bought. Somewhere in the airport, there was a man still trying to figure out why a strange woman was eating his cookies. Now, here's what I want you to listen to this and don't miss in this. I find it interesting, instead of reacting and retaliating, the man, I'm sure, though shocked, gets up, breaks his last cookie in half and offers it to her, and then walks away. I find it interesting that I'm sure he struggled, but he rejected what was acceptable and he did what was abnormal. I also find it, on the other hand, interesting that I'm sure later, as she discovered, knowing now she's the one who had wronged the man, boy, if you could put yourself in the situation, this didn't happen in just moments. It took time, right? How much energy she exhausted. Now watch this. Over cookies. And I just wonder how many people ended a marriage over a cookie. I wonder how many people have unfriended someone on Facebook because of a cookie. I wonder how many people went to a different church because of a cookie. You can, again, I say that because what I'm about to say, you're going to have to figure out I can't. You can justify it all you want. I don't care what you go through. They're cookies compared to the cross of Jesus Christ. They're cookies. Stupid little packs of cookies. I don't say this with any attention to me. But I'm sure many of you could assume the fact when you're somewhere for 25 years, there's a lot of things you go through and experience. Oh, I've wanted to hold on to some things. I've even spent time sharing with people that Dr. Joanne Lyon or Wes Smith, my DS, and just trying to process through, but I'm doing it because I want to process through. But here's what I would say, but I'm still here because my God is bigger. My God is greater. Nothing can separate me from him. We use the word revenge. It's amazing how deep that stuff really gets into our life, isn't it? How much time we consume. How much sin we commit when we start talking to other people in ways we shouldn't be talking. Have we gone up the mountain? Are we sitting at the feet of Jesus, who will give us everything he has because of his love for us? I say this again. What is it about my heart that tends to lead to my thoughts that I'll spend so much time exhausting what someone had done to me, and so little time I will spend on what he has done for me? Love one another as I've loved you, Jesus says, for that love covers a multitude of sins. Amen. Father, as we come to communion, what a way to come. Truly. Man, I look at this week and I think of some of the things that I gave my time and my mind to, and I'm like, wow, that was not worth it. Why? But instead of sitting and beating myself down, I look at the cross that picked me up, and I'm reminded again how much I need you, to let my thoughts just rest in you, that I can just love and embrace others as you has loved and embraced me. We live in a broken world, of which I'm one. A broken world that does broken things. But that's why you came. That you would love the world that laid down your life, and you invited me to do the same. And that's what I'm praying at this communion we will do. Begin with ourselves and just lay it down. Just lay it down. What others may have done, of which I am one. I've done things too. And just focus on what you have done for us. God, thank you.